Daniel Whitmore was less than 30 seconds from signing away $800 million when a pediatric nurse told him that an 8-year-old boy in room 214 had spent the morning asking whether his father was finally coming. The conference room remained motionless around him, crowded with attorneys, board members, and investors who had waited 11 months for this acquisition. Yet Daniel could no longer hear the pages turning or the traffic moving 40 floors below downtown Boston. He tightened his hand around the phone and asked the nurse to repeat herself because the first time had sounded impossible, and the second time sounded like an accusation disguised as a mistake. The woman introduced herself as Emily Sanders from St. Gabriel Children's Hospital, then explained that the boy knew Daniel's full name, recognized his photograph, and had refused an important procedure until someone promised to try reaching him. Daniel stared at the unsigned contract, suddenly remembering Naomi Carter standing beside a packed suitcase nearly 9 years earlier, pregnant, exhausted, and waiting for him to choose something other than the company he had built. Before he could ask how sick the child was, Emily lowered her voice and said Naomi had not authorized anyone to discuss his diagnosis, but the medical team needed a decision within hours, and the boy believed Daniel might be the only person who could help him make it. Daniel rose so abruptly that his chair struck the glass wall behind him, causing every person in the room to turn toward him with the careful silence people reserved for unstable markets and private disasters. His chairman, Richard Hale, placed one hand over the acquisition documents and reminded him that the opposing company's representatives were already downstairs, their financing window closed at noon, and any delay could expose Whitmore Medical Technologies to penalties large enough to threaten its newest research division. Daniel heard the warning, understood every consequence, and still found himself asking Emily whether Naomi was beside the boy, because some frightened part of him needed proof that the past had not returned without the one person capable of explaining it. Emily answered that Naomi was meeting with a specialist, then added that she had not asked the hospital to call Daniel and might not welcome his arrival. That detail made the situation more believable and more terrifying, because Naomi had never used desperation as a weapon, even when Daniel had given her every reason to. He told his assistant to delay the signing for 1 hour, ignored Richard's sharp objection, and left the room carrying only his phone, his coat, and the knowledge that he might already be too late to repair whatever decision had brought a frightened child to room 214. The ride to St. Gabriel should have taken 25 minutes, but Daniel reached the hospital in 18, moving through Boston traffic with the controlled recklessness of a man who had spent his life believing speed could compensate for absence. Along the way, he searched Naomi's name online for the first time in years and found almost nothing beyond an old nursing license, a community health article, and a photograph from a neighborhood science program where she stood beside a group of children holding homemade rockets. There was no mention of marriage, no public record connecting her to another man, and nothing explaining why their son had suddenly needed him after nearly a decade of silence. Daniel called Emily again, but the nurse declined to reveal more, explaining that hospital policy required Naomi's consent before medical details could be shared, particularly with a man who was not listed as a legal guardian. Her caution humiliated him, although he knew it was justified because biology did not grant him the rights that 9 years of responsibility should have earned. When he asked why Elijah had refused the procedure, Emily paused before saying the boy had recently discovered something about Daniel's company, and since then had become convinced that his father needed to hear what he knew before the doctors continued. Emily met him near the pediatric elevators, wearing blue scrubs and an expression that carried neither admiration nor hostility, only the guarded professionalism of someone protecting a vulnerable family. She explained that Elijah had been admitted after recurring fevers, joint pain, severe fatigue, and abnormal blood work, and although the doctors believed his condition was treatable, a sudden complication had forced them to consider an invasive diagnostic procedure that afternoon. Naomi had approved it, but Elijah had become frightened after overhearing 2 physicians discuss a medication connected to Whitmore Medical Technologies, and he now believed his absent father had invented something that might save him. Daniel felt a colder fear settle beneath his ribs, because his company had developed several immune regulation therapies, but none had been approved for children with unclear diagnoses. He asked whether anyone had promised Elijah access to experimental treatment, and Emily immediately said no, then warned that the child's hope had grown from fragments of information rather than medical fact. Before they reached room 214, she stopped beside a quiet family lounge and told Daniel that arriving was only the first difficult choice, because Naomi had spent years building a stable life without him, and Elijah's illness did not give him permission to enter that life carelessly. Through the narrow window in the hospital door, Daniel saw a boy with dark braided hair sitting upright against white pillows, carefully attaching a wing to a small model airplane while an intravenous line disappeared beneath the sleeve of his pajamas. A spiral notebook rested open beside him, covered with hand-drawn diagrams of medical drones, delivery routes, and a company logo Daniel recognized as his own, copied with the uneven precision of a child who had studied it for weeks. Daniel could not move, because Elijah's concentrated frown resembled the expression Daniel's mother used to tease him about when he was young, and the familiarity felt more convincing than any document could have. Then Naomi appeared at the far end of the hallway carrying a paper cup and a red folder filled with medical records, and the instant she saw Daniel, the folder slipped slightly in her grasp. She recovered before it fell, but her face changed in a way he remembered too well, not with anger, but with the quiet preparation of someone expecting disappointment. Daniel said her name, and Naomi answered with a controlled nod before asking Emily why he was there, although the answer stood visibly between them. Emily explained that Elijah had requested the call, and Naomi closed her eyes briefly, as if she had known this moment might arrive but had hoped for more time to prepare. Daniel began with the sentence he had rehearsed in the car, telling her he had never known their child existed, but Naomi stopped him before he could turn ignorance into innocence. She said she believed he had not known Elijah was born, yet reminded him that he had known she was pregnant, known where she worked, known the names of their closest friends, and possessed every resource necessary to learn what happened after he left. Daniel accepted the distinction without defending himself, because the returned letters he had never received could not erase the years during which he had chosen not to ask a single question. Naomi opened the red folder and removed a sealed envelope marked with Elijah's name, then told Daniel the hospital had discovered a genetic marker that might affect the treatment decision, and the doctors needed family medical history from both biological parents before proceeding. She handed him the envelope but did not release it immediately, warning that if he opened it, he could no longer pretend his only responsibility was to answer one frightened child's phone call. Daniel took the envelope, yet before he could break the seal, the door to room 214 opened, and Elijah looked directly at him with the solemn curiosity of someone recognizing a face from photographs rather than memory. Naomi moved first, entering the room and asking whether he felt strong enough for a visitor, while Daniel remained in the doorway, suddenly unsure whether crossing 3 feet of polished floor would be an intrusion. Elijah studied his suit, his silver watch, and the company badge still clipped inside his coat, then asked whether he was truly Daniel Whitmore or merely someone the hospital had sent to calm him down. Daniel answered that he was Daniel, and after a silence that seemed longer than their 9 missing years, Elijah asked whether he could call him Dad, or whether that was something adults needed to discuss first. Naomi's expression tightened, but she allowed Daniel to answer, and he said the word belonged to Elijah whenever he felt ready, although Daniel understood he had not yet earned anything attached to it. Elijah nodded thoughtfully, then pointed toward the unfinished airplane and said he had been waiting because one wing would not lock into place, and his mother claimed engineers were supposed to be useful in emergencies. Daniel sat beside the bed and examined the plastic piece, grateful for a problem simple enough to solve without explanations, apologies, or medical consent forms. Elijah watched his hands carefully as he adjusted the wing, then asked whether Daniel really made medicine for people whose bodies attack themselves, because a doctor had mentioned Whitmore's new immune platform outside the room. Daniel explained that his company developed tools scientists could use to study certain diseases, but no responsible doctor could promise that one treatment would work before knowing exactly what illness a patient had. Elijah absorbed the answer without visible disappointment, which made Daniel realize the boy had not demanded a miracle, only honesty from a man he had imagined through newspaper articles and carefully filtered stories. When the wing finally clicked into place, Elijah smiled and said Naomi had always told him his father was good at fixing complicated things, although she had never explained why he had not fixed their family. The question struck with the precision children sometimes achieved without cruelty, and Daniel answered that he had mistaken leaving for protecting people from his failures, when in reality leaving had protected only himself from seeing the harm he caused. Naomi interrupted before the conversation became too heavy, reminding Elijah that the doctors still needed to complete several tests, then asked Daniel to step into the hall. She told him the genetic marker suggested a hereditary immune disorder that had remained dormant until a recent infection triggered worsening symptoms. And because Daniel's mother had died young from what his family had always called unexplained organ failure, the specialist believed his medical history might clarify Elijah's diagnosis. Daniel had never questioned his mother's death beyond the grief he buried at 21. But Naomi produced a photocopy of an old pathology report she had obtained after Elijah's first abnormal test. The report mentioned inflammatory damage, renal complications, and an antibody pattern that modern specialists might interpret differently, though the records were incomplete and legally restricted. Naomi explained that she had contacted Daniel's former family physician weeks earlier, not Daniel himself, because she needed medical facts rather than emotional promises. The physician had refused to release anything without Daniel's authorization, leaving them with only the report Daniel's aunt had once mailed Naomi during the pregnancy, believing both parents should know the family's history. Daniel opened the sealed envelope and found a consent form, a request for his medical records, and a preliminary report indicating that Elijah's most likely diagnosis required treatment soon to prevent permanent organ damage. The report did not identify his company's experimental therapy as a solution. Instead, it recommended a combination of established medications, close monitoring, and a specialized infusion that had recently become difficult to obtain because of a nationwide supply disruption. Whitmore Medical Technologies did not manufacture the drug, but Daniel recognized the supplier and knew the acquisition waiting downtown involved the company controlling its most important production facility. The revelation changed the problem from personal guilt into a conflict with consequences for thousands of patients, because the acquisition agreement included a restructuring plan that would close the older Boston production line for 6 months, while manufacturing shifted overseas. Richard had assured the board that hospitals held sufficient inventory, yet Elijah's chart showed St. Gabriel had enough medication for only 3 more pediatric patients. Naomi saw recognition move across Daniel's face and asked what the document meant. But before he could answer, his phone displayed 5 missed calls from Richard and an urgent message warning that the seller had threatened to withdraw. Daniel asked Emily to arrange an immediate meeting with the hospital pharmacist and Elijah's specialist, then called Richard from the empty consultation room while Naomi listened. He demanded the current inventory projections for the infusion drug and asked whether the acquisition team had independently verified the seller's claim that existing supplies could support the transition. Richard replied that regulatory consultants had reviewed the numbers, though his irritation suggested the question threatened more than the schedule, and he reminded Daniel that Whitmore was buying research patents rather than assuming responsibility for every weakness in the seller's distribution network. Daniel pressed harder, asking why the Boston production shutdown had been described as operational efficiency when it might create a pediatric shortage within weeks. Richard became silent before admitting that the seller had disclosed temporary regional deficits, but the board had classified them as manageable because alternative manufacturers were expected to increase output. Daniel knew expectation was not evidence, especially when children with rare conditions depended on exact formulations, and he told Richard not to sign anything until he personally reviewed the supply data. Richard answered that the board had already called an emergency vote to remove Daniel's authority over the deal if he failed to return before noon. Naomi waited until the call ended, then asked whether Daniel intended to use Elijah's illness as a reason to abandon a business decision he should have questioned months earlier. Her challenge surprised him because he had expected gratitude, but she refused to let his sudden guilt masquerade as moral courage. She said canceling the acquisition might protect Elijah temporarily while harming employees, investors, and other patients, particularly if Daniel made another enormous decision based on fear instead of complete information. Daniel admitted she was right, then explained that the immediate danger was not the acquisition itself, but a hidden supply assumption buried beneath financial language no one had tested against actual hospital demand. Naomi's anger shifted into professional focus, and as a neonatal nurse with experience coordinating scarce medications, she offered to connect him with regional pharmacists who could verify whether St. Gabriel's shortage was isolated. Together they began calling hospitals, and within 40 minutes they discovered the same pattern across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and parts of Connecticut. The shortage was real. The alternative supplier had delayed expansion, and someone involved in the acquisition had known long enough to prevent the crisis. The discovery forced Daniel to make a choice more complicated than staying at Elijah's bedside or returning to a conference room, because saving one child now required him to confront a corporate failure he had helped create through years of unquestioned control. He asked Naomi whether she would allow a private blood sample and medical screening, explaining that confirming the inherited marker could help Elijah's doctors narrow the diagnosis while also revealing whether Daniel faced the same condition. Naomi agreed, but only after making him promise that medical access would never become a shortcut around the legal and emotional boundaries he had ignored for 9 years. Daniel signed every consent form, provided blood for testing, and authorized the release of his mother's archived records, then arranged for an independent supply chain specialist to join the acquisition review remotely. Throughout the process, Elijah remained unaware of the corporate crisis unfolding around him, although he sensed enough tension to ask whether Daniel had changed his mind about staying. Daniel returned to the room, removed his watch, placed it face down on the table, and told Elijah that staying did not mean ignoring every other responsibility, but it did mean refusing to disappear whenever responsibilities became difficult. Elijah accepted that answer, then showed Daniel the notebook filled with sketches for emergency drones capable of delivering medicine to rural hospitals during storms. He explained that Naomi had helped him research communities where patients traveled hours for treatment, and his science teacher had encouraged him to design something useful instead of merely impressive. Daniel recognized Naomi's influence in every page, particularly the belief that technology mattered only when it reached people who were usually forgotten. One drawing included a small landing pad marked Room 214, and beneath it Elijah had written, "No medicine should arrive too late." Daniel asked when he had written the sentence, and Elijah said it came after hearing Naomi argue with the hospital pharmacy about the delayed infusion. The words exposed how much fear the boy had quietly absorbed while adults tried to protect him. And Daniel realized that Elijah's refusal of the procedure had not been childish stubbornness. He had believed delaying the test might delay a treatment the hospital could not guarantee, and he wanted his father present because Daniel's public speeches always claimed healthcare problems could be solved when powerful people accepted responsibility. By noon, the board convened through a secure video call, and Daniel joined from a small hospital meeting room with Naomi, Richard, 2 independent directors, the acquisition attorneys, and Dr. Priya Desai, the supply specialist Daniel had contacted. Richard began by arguing that Daniel's personal emergency had impaired his judgment, then requested authority to complete the transaction before the seller withdrew its financing. Daniel did not mention Elijah by name because he refused to turn his son's private illness into leverage, but he presented verified hospital inventories showing that the planned factory closure would create a critical regional shortage within 6 weeks. Dr. Desai confirmed that the alternative manufacturer had failed a quality inspection and could not legally increase production until corrective measures were completed. One attorney claimed the information had arrived too late to alter the agreement, yet Naomi identified a disclosure clause requiring the seller to report any foreseeable interruption affecting medically vulnerable populations. The clause had been marked satisfied, despite internal emails indicating the seller knew about the failed inspection 3 months earlier. Richard's expression changed when Daniel displayed the email chain because one message had been forwarded to his office before the final valuation meeting. He insisted that his staff had reviewed only financial implications, not clinical consequences, and accused Daniel of creating a spectacle to avoid admitting he had abandoned the negotiations. Daniel answered that leadership was not proven by finishing every deal, but by knowing when the facts no longer supported the decision, then proposed delaying the acquisition for 72 hours while Whitmore financed emergency production at the Boston plant. The seller's representatives threatened litigation, but Daniel's attorneys confirmed that incomplete disclosure gave Whitmore legitimate grounds to suspend closing. Several directors supported the delay, while others feared the company's stock would fall once the market learned the acquisition had stalled. Richard requested an immediate vote, expecting Daniel's hospital absence and personal involvement to weaken him, but Naomi quietly slid another printed document across the table. It showed that Richard had approved a cost-saving bonus tied directly to the Boston shutdown, giving him a financial incentive to minimize the shortage risk. Richard denied wrongdoing and accused Naomi of accessing confidential information, but she explained that the bonus structure appeared in a public compensation filing anyone could examine. Daniel understood that the evidence did not prove fraud, yet it exposed a conflict Richard should have disclosed before leading the board's assessment. The independent directors voted to suspend Richard from the acquisition committee, postpone the deal, and authorize emergency measures to maintain production while investigators reviewed the disclosure process. The decision protected the medication supply, but it also triggered an automatic penalty that erased nearly $60 million from Whitmore's projected annual earnings. Daniel accepted the loss without performance or self-congratulation, because the money represented consequences that could have been avoided had he built a culture where uncomfortable questions mattered more than executive certainty. After the call, Naomi told him he had made the correct decision for the correct reason, which was different from making a dramatic sacrifice because his own child happened to be affected. Daniel thanked her, then admitted that if Elijah had not been admitted, he might have signed the contract without ever reading the operational appendix closely enough to understand what it concealed. The doctors received Daniel's preliminary genetic results later that afternoon, confirming that he carried the same rare marker found in Elijah, although he had never developed severe symptoms. Combined with his mother's pathology report, the evidence allowed the specialist to diagnose Elijah more confidently and avoid a riskier procedure that had originally been scheduled. Dr. Harrison explained that treatment could begin as soon as the hospital secured the infusion medication, which Daniel now knew would arrive the following morning from emergency inventory released after the board vote. Relief softened Naomi's posture for the first time, but she reminded Daniel that one correct decision did not erase the years during which she had carried every medical, financial, and emotional responsibility alone. Daniel agreed, then asked whether Elijah's birth certificate listed another father, not because he feared competition, but because he needed to understand the family structure before making promises. Naomi answered that no one had taken his legal place, although several good people had filled the practical spaces he abandoned. Among them was Marcus Reed, Elijah's science teacher and Naomi's longtime friend, who was already on his way to the hospital and had never once failed to show up when Elijah needed him. Marcus arrived carrying a backpack filled with school assignments, a repaired tablet, and the unforced familiarity of a man who knew which vending machine snack Elijah preferred after blood tests. Daniel recognized him from the community science article he had found online, and the realization that this stranger possessed years of ordinary memories with his son stirred an emotion Daniel initially mistook for jealousy. Marcus greeted Naomi with a brief embrace, asked Emily for an update, then entered Elijah's room without hesitation, where the boy immediately brightened and began explaining that his father had finally come. The sentence placed Daniel and Marcus on opposite sides of an invisible boundary, one defined not by biology, but by accumulated trust. Marcus did not challenge Daniel's presence, yet after Elijah began resting, he asked to speak privately and made clear that he would not watch another adult enter the boy's life through grand promises, expensive gifts, or temporary guilt. Daniel answered that he had no intention of replacing anyone who had earned Elijah's love, although he understood that saying the correct words required less courage than living by them. Marcus explained that Elijah had struggled every Father's Day despite Naomi's efforts to protect him from bitterness, and during the previous year, he had begun collecting Daniel's interviews in a private folder. The boy admired Daniel's inventions but distrusted his speeches about responsibility, often asking why a man who wanted medicine to reach strangers had never tried to reach his own son. Naomi had avoided contacting Daniel because Elijah's early childhood was stable, and later because each passing year made the potential rejection more dangerous. When Elijah became sick, however, he found Daniel's company name on a hospital document and became convinced the illness had created a reason his father could not ignore. Marcus said the phone call had not been Naomi's plan, nor the nurse's idea. Elijah had memorized Daniel's corporate office number, persuaded a volunteer to call, and continued asking until Emily located Daniel's private contact through an emergency executive directory. The truth embarrassed Daniel because his son had worked harder to find him during one frightened morning than Daniel had worked to find Elijah in nearly 9 years. That evening, Daniel remained at the hospital while Naomi drove home to collect clothes, and Marcus left only after Elijah's first infusion began without complications. Daniel sat beside the bed reading aloud from a book about early aviation, pausing whenever Elijah's eyes closed, then continuing when the boy quietly asked him not to stop. Near midnight, Elijah woke with chills and nausea, and although the nurses explained that the reaction was expected and manageable, Daniel felt panic rise through him with the force of every missed fever, injury, and sleepless night he had never witnessed. He reached for his phone to call a specialist he knew, but Naomi returned at that moment and gently stopped him, reminding him that Elijah's doctors understood the treatment and did not need a wealthy executive disrupting the room to feel useful. Daniel put the phone away, held the basin when Elijah became sick, replaced the cool cloth across his forehead, and stayed silent, while Naomi demonstrated the kind of competence built through years of necessity. For the first time, Daniel understood that his instinct to solve every crisis through influence could become another form of absence if it prevented him from participating in the ordinary discomfort of care. During the long hours before dawn, Naomi finally explained what had happened after their separation, not to excuse her silence, but to give Daniel the complete history he had never sought. She had mailed a letter after Elijah's birth, enclosing a photograph and asking Daniel to contact her when he was ready to discuss custody and support. But the envelope returned because Daniel had moved without forwarding personal mail. She called his old office twice and left messages with an assistant, though neither message reached him, because Richard, then Daniel's chief of staff, had instructed employees to filter communications from anyone connected to Daniel's former marriage. Daniel stared at her, recognizing a pattern more serious than a misplaced letter, and asked whether she had proof of the calls. Naomi produced notes from an old planner containing dates, names, and confirmation numbers, records she had preserved for legal reasons, before deciding that a court battle might bring Daniel's money into Elijah's life without bringing Daniel himself. She had also received one unsigned payment check from a Whitmore corporate account 6 months later, accompanied by a letter suggesting she accept a confidential settlement and waive future claims. Daniel had never authorized the payment, and the discovery transformed Richard's conduct from self-interested negligence into deliberate interference. Naomi explained that she returned the check untouched, believing Daniel had chosen to reduce their child to a liability, while Daniel had spent the same years assuming Naomi wanted no further contact. Neither assumption absolved him, because he could have asked, searched, or challenged the convenient silence, yet someone inside his company had actively protected his ambition by erasing every reminder of his abandoned family. Daniel contacted his general counsel and ordered a forensic review of archived correspondence, corporate payments, and Richard's authority during the company's early expansion. The attorney warned that any confirmed misconduct could expose Whitmore to litigation, public scandal, and claims that Daniel's leadership had depended on employees manipulating his private life. Daniel answered that concealment had already caused enough damage, and the company would face the truth regardless of cost. Naomi watched him carefully, then said accountability would mean accepting consequences, even if the investigation proved he had benefited from decisions he never personally requested. By morning, Elijah's fever had eased, and he opened his eyes to find Daniel asleep in the chair, with one hand resting near the edge of the bed. The boy studied him before quietly asking Naomi whether his father had stayed all night, and when she said yes, Elijah reached across the blanket and touched Daniel's wrist. Daniel woke immediately, disoriented for a moment, then smiled when Elijah whispered that the infusion had been difficult, but the airplane had survived beside him. Their fragile peace lasted only minutes before Daniel's attorney called with the first archive discovery. Richard's office had received Naomi's messages, created the unauthorized settlement, and classified her pregnancy as a reputational risk during a critical funding round. More disturbing, the records contained Daniel's electronic approval on a broad authorization, allowing Richard to resolve personal distractions without further consultation. Daniel remembered signing the document among dozens of financing papers, never reading the language closely enough to understand what power he surrendered. Richard had acted deceptively, but Daniel's indifference had opened the door, and exposing the truth would not allow him to present himself as merely another victim. Daniel told Naomi everything before speaking to the board, including the authorization bearing his signature and the likelihood that public disclosure would damage his company, his reputation, and any future custody petition. Naomi listened without rescuing him from the consequences, then said the document confirmed what she had believed years earlier, although the distinction between deliberate rejection and reckless delegation mattered more to Elijah than it did to her. Daniel asked whether she intended to sue him, and Naomi answered that she would make legal decisions based on Elijah's security, not Daniel's guilt or the company's stock price. She also warned him that confessing publicly could become another dramatic gesture centered on his redemption, while the child who had suffered remained reduced to a symbol in someone else's story. Daniel accepted the criticism and proposed that the investigation remain confidential until independent counsel determined what had occurred, while he began fulfilling financial responsibilities through formal family court channels rather than private arrangements. Naomi agreed to meet with attorneys after Elijah's discharge, though she refused any custody schedule until Daniel demonstrated consistency beyond the emotionally intense environment of a hospital. Richard arrived at St. Gabriel before the board could formally suspend him, demanding a private conversation and insisting that his actions had protected Daniel during the company's most vulnerable years. He argued that investors would have withdrawn if the founder's divorce, unborn child, and unstable personal life had become public during negotiations, costing hundreds of employees their jobs and destroying technology that later helped thousands of patients. Daniel answered that Richard had converted assumptions into authority, denied Naomi information, intercepted messages, and created a settlement designed to remove a child from the future of a man too busy to notice. Richard did not deny the conduct. Instead, he claimed Daniel had rewarded him for eliminating every obstacle, often saying he wanted no distractions until the company became secure. The accusation was painful because it contained enough truth to resist easy condemnation, and Daniel admitted that Richard had learned his values from the priorities Daniel demonstrated every day. Still, he explained that understanding how corruption began did not excuse continuing it for 9 years, particularly when Richard had recently concealed a medication shortage to protect another transaction. Richard lowered his voice and warned that if Daniel released the archived documents, he would tell the board Daniel had known about Naomi's pregnancy, abandoned her willingly, and signed authority broad enough to make every later action appear approved. Daniel replied that all of those facts should be examined, then refused Richard's demand to resign quietly in exchange for sealed records. Naomi, who had overheard part of the conversation from the doorway, told Richard that Daniel's shame no longer gave either man the right to decide what truth she and Elijah could survive. Richard left under hospital security escort after the general counsel notified him that his access had been revoked, but his final warning remained credible. Within an hour, a business reporter contacted Daniel's office asking about an executive dispute, a hidden heir, and allegations that Whitmore Medical Technologies had suppressed information affecting pediatric patients. Someone had leaked enough fragments to create scandal without context, forcing Daniel to decide whether silence would protect Elijah's privacy or allow Richard to shape the story first. Daniel met Naomi, Marcus, and the hospital's patient advocate in a private room before responding publicly. He explained that reporters might discover Elijah's identity, and although the company could seek injunctions against publishing protected medical information, no legal strategy could guarantee complete privacy once speculation spread online. Marcus advised Daniel to step away from the spotlight and let corporate counsel address the acquisition, while family attorneys protected Elijah, because a public confession could attract attention the boy had never requested. Naomi agreed, but she also understood that silence might permit false claims that she had hidden a child for money or contacted Daniel only after he became wealthy. After careful discussion, they chose a narrow statement confirming an internal investigation into acquisition disclosures and historical executive misconduct, while refusing to discuss any minor child or private family matter. Daniel added one sentence, accepting personal responsibility for failures and oversight, though he did not describe himself as redeemed, victimized, or misunderstood. The statement disappointed reporters seeking spectacle, but it prevented the company from using Naomi or Elijah as shields. Elijah improved steadily over the next 2 days, and the doctors prepared to discharge him with a demanding medication schedule, dietary restrictions, and frequent follow-up appointments. Daniel attended every training session, yet Naomi required him to demonstrate each task rather than merely observe professionals perform it. He learned how to organize doses, recognize warning signs, record temperatures, contact the care team, and remain calm when instructions seemed frightening. Elijah watched with amusement as Daniel struggled to secure a child-proof medication cap, then offered advice with the patience of someone pleased that his father finally needed to learn something from him. Before leaving the hospital, Elijah asked whether Daniel would ride home with them, but Naomi said they needed to begin slowly, and Daniel supported her decision despite the disappointment on the boy's face. He promised to visit the following afternoon at a time Naomi approved, then wrote the appointment into a plain paper calendar instead of his phone, because Elijah wanted to see where he fit among the other days. The next afternoon, Daniel arrived 5 minutes early, carrying groceries from Naomi's list, rather than toys, electronics, or extravagant gifts. Elijah showed him the block city in his bedroom, including a hospital, a school, a drone station, and a narrow bridge connecting 2 neighborhoods. When Daniel asked why the bridge remained unfinished, Elijah said every version collapsed because he kept building the towers too quickly and forgetting to strengthen the middle. The metaphor was obvious enough that a lesser conversation might have turned sentimental, but Daniel simply sat on the floor and asked whether Elijah wanted help testing a stronger design. Over the following weeks, Daniel returned when promised, left when Naomi requested space, attended medical appointments without dominating them, and accepted that Marcus remained an important presence. His company continued without him during several critical days, proving that delegation could support responsibility when it was transparent, limited, and accountable, rather than used to erase inconvenient human needs. The independent investigation eventually confirmed Richard's interference, the unauthorized settlement, the hidden shortage projections, and Daniel's negligent approval of language that enabled the misconduct. Richard was removed and referred for civil review, while Daniel surrendered his annual bonus, established an independently governed patient supply fund, and asked the board to separate the roles of chairman and chief executive officer. He did not announce those actions as charity, because part of the money compensated for harm created under his leadership. Naomi filed for formal child support and a gradual visitation plan, and Daniel signed without negotiation, understanding that fairness should not depend on whether the responsible parent felt generous. Yet just as their new routine began to feel stable, Elijah's follow-up tests showed that the medication had controlled his inflammation, but not reversed the kidney damage already present. Dr. Harrison explained that Elijah might eventually need a transplant evaluation, and Daniel's genetic connection made him a possible donor, though compatibility was uncertain and no decision could be made without further testing. Daniel agreed to testing before Dr. Harrison finished explaining the process, but Naomi immediately reminded him that eagerness was not the same as informed consent, and Elijah's future could not depend on another impulsive act. The transplant team evaluated Daniel privately, reviewing his genetic marker, kidney function, cardiovascular health, and psychological readiness, while making clear that donation would never purchase parental rights or emotional forgiveness. Daniel accepted those boundaries and told the psychologist that he wanted to help, because Elijah needed options, not because surgery could compress 9 years of responsibility into one heroic moment. The testing revealed that Daniel was a compatible donor, though the doctors did not recommend immediate transplantation because Elijah's condition remained stable enough for continued treatment. Instead of feeling disappointed that he could not perform a dramatic rescue, Daniel experienced a quieter gratitude, knowing his role was to remain healthy, available, and dependable if the need ever came. Naomi recognized the change because the man she once knew would have searched for one grand solution, while the man beside her now understood that waiting responsibly could require more courage. Months passed through ordinary routines rather than miraculous transformation, and those routines slowly became the evidence Naomi trusted most. Daniel attended parent-teacher conferences, learned which foods triggered Elijah's nausea, sat through long clinic delays without taking business calls, and never used missed work as proof of sacrifice. He and Naomi did not restore their marriage, because healing did not require pretending the past had never happened. Yet their conversations became less guarded as shared responsibility replaced old assumptions. Marcus continued teaching Elijah and joined them at science events, while Daniel learned that gratitude felt healthier than rivalry toward the man who had protected his son's curiosity during the years he was absent. Whitmore Medical Technologies recovered from the delayed acquisition after negotiating new terms that preserved the Boston production line and required transparent supply safeguards. The company's valuation fell temporarily, but employee confidence improved, hospital partnerships strengthened, and Daniel discovered that ethical correction could create stability more durable than unchecked growth. 1 year after the phone call, Elijah entered a regional young inventors competition with a redesigned medical drone system capable of transporting temperature-sensitive medication between hospitals during shortages. His project used a network model inspired by the crisis at St. Gabriel, though he refused to place Daniel's company logo anywhere on the display because he wanted judges to evaluate the idea rather than his father's name. Daniel respected the decision and helped only when Elijah requested technical guidance, while Naomi supervised the medical accuracy and Marcus challenged the boy to explain every assumption clearly. On the morning of the competition, Elijah became anxious after seeing projects built with expensive equipment, and Daniel recognized the familiar fear that achievement might determine whether love and respect remain secure. He told Elijah that winning would not make the work meaningful, because the project already mattered if it solved a real problem, and taught him to question weak evidence. Elijah smiled and answered that Daniel finally sounded less like the speeches he gave online and more like someone who had actually learned something. Elijah won second place, which initially disappointed him until the first place student approached and asked whether they could combine their designs for a national competition. Daniel watched his son choose collaboration over resentment, then understood that Naomi had preserved more than Elijah's hope in his father. She had preserved his ability to trust people without becoming naive. During the awards photographs, Elijah reached for Naomi's hand first, then Daniel's, and invited Marcus to stand beside them because, as he explained, families should include the people who actually show up. The photograph did not resemble the polished restoration Daniel might once have imagined, yet it represented something more honest, a family shaped by accountability rather than appearances. Afterward, they returned to Naomi's home for a modest dinner, where Elijah placed the silver ribbon beside his model airplane from the hospital and announced that the unfinished bridge in his block city had finally stopped collapsing. Daniel asked what he had changed, and Elijah said he had rebuilt the support slowly, tested each section, and stopped expecting the middle to hold simply because both sides looked strong. Later that evening, Naomi walked Daniel to his car while Elijah prepared for bed, and the cool Boston air carried the first hint of autumn. She told Daniel that Elijah had asked whether the visitation schedule could include occasional weekends, not because Daniel had donated money, changed company policy, or offered a kidney, but because he had arrived consistently, even when nothing dramatic happened. Daniel felt the significance of the request, yet he asked Naomi what pace she believed was safe, refusing to turn Elijah's affection into permission to rush. Naomi said they could begin with one Saturday each month, provided Daniel continued following the medical routine and respected Elijah's relationship with the community that had raised him. Daniel agreed, then thanked her for telling their son enough truth to preserve hope without inventing excuses for him. Naomi answered that she had never wanted Elijah to inherit her pain, but she had also learned that protecting a child from bitterness did not mean protecting an adult from consequences. As Daniel opened his car door, his phone began ringing, and both of them paused at the familiar sound. The caller was Richard Hale, whose civil case was approaching settlement and whose attorneys had requested one final private conversation, but Daniel declined the call without fear, anger, or theatrical satisfaction. He forwarded the number to counsel, then placed the phone back into his pocket because some calls required answers, while others required boundaries. Naomi noticed the difference and smiled faintly before returning inside, leaving Daniel alone beneath the porch light, with no guarantee that their former marriage would ever become anything beyond respectful partnership. He no longer needed a perfect ending to prove he had changed, because the life ahead of him would be measured through appointments kept, mistakes admitted, and ordinary days in which he chose presence over convenience. Before driving away, he looked through the front window and saw Elijah carrying the repaired airplane toward his bedroom, one hand resting beneath each wing so neither side bore the weight alone. Several years later, when Elijah's kidney function eventually declined, Daniel donated without cameras, company announcements, or public praise, and Naomi remained beside both of them through the difficult recovery. The surgery did not erase the years Daniel had missed, but it extended the years he could help protect, which was the only meaning he allowed himself to claim. Elijah later transformed his childhood drone design into a university research project focused on emergency medical delivery, supported by an independent scholarship bearing Naomi's name rather than Daniel's. During the first public demonstration, a reporter asked Elijah which moment had inspired his work, expecting him to mention the transplant, the hospital crisis, or his father's company. Elijah looked toward Naomi, Marcus, and Daniel, before answering that his life changed the day someone finally stayed long enough to learn that love was not a feeling people announced during emergencies. Love was the structure they strengthened afterward, one ordinary decision at a time, until the bridge could carry everyone safely home.